Hello, this is Lydia Brown, they, them pronouns. I'm a youngish East Asian person with short black and teal hair. Today I'm wearing a jacket and over a black shirt. The shirt says, I am not a token. And the pin that I'm wearing says, difficult, difficult, lemon, difficult. It was a gift from a friend and fellow disabled organizer. I'm in front of a corner of a room with 2 windows and black shades. I want to begin our time with a moment of pause and reflection, an invitation to each of you who are present now to breathe, to tune in, to listen to what your body-mind is telling you about what it is that you need, what you crave, what you desire. This is an invitation to consider what it is that you are carrying with you, what it is that you have brought into this space. Your anger, your rage, the fury of generations and ancestors, your grief, your sorrow, your mourning. An invitation to consider what you carry with you in our moments of stolen joy and pleasure, our gratitude, the exhaustion, the bone weariness that so many of us carry with us day in and day out. Let this moment of pause, this moment of rest serve as a reminder to us that our needs are not burdensome or wrong, that all of our body minds have needs, that our needs deserve to be met. The work that I do is grounded in a framework and practice of disability justice, which itself is a framework co-created largely by Black and Brown and queer and trans disabled people. And the framework and principles of disability justice teach us, among many other lessons, that all of our body minds have needs, that our needs deserve to be met, that we are worthy, that we are valuable, that we are loved. Disability justice reminds us that there is no such thing as a person who does not deserve to exist. There is no such thing as a person who is useless, or a person who is pointless, or a person who does not deserve to be. Our gathering today is centered on discussion of the legacies and current realities of eugenics. And many of us know, especially if we're in this space, that eugenics is not simply a term of the past from the Centennial Congress a year ago. That eugenics did not die at the end of the Third Reich to the Nazi regime. That eugenics did not disappear with the end of the Nazi rule, with the end of the supposed large-scale institutionalization of disabled people that apparently is not happening anymore, which would be news to the literally thousands of disabled people within and outside the bounds of the illegitimate nation where we live and work now. Eugenics is not over, it has never left. The community where I come from, the community in which I have my roots as an organizer, that is the autistic community, has long grappled with the question of eugenics in our modern day organizing. For literally decades now, autistic people have contended rhetoricize autistic people as victims of kidnapping by this mysterious disease called autism, that we are innocent and trapped inside brains that are basically prisons in our own minds, that autism itself destroys marriages, destroys families, that autism prevents autistic people from being able to form relationships, from being able to be loved or to love others, that autism itself is a problem. And we've seen an outgrowth, not just of rhetoric of this type, but of policies enacted to further the disappearance and the desired elimination of autism. One of the most notorious organizations operating in the autism sphere has been Autism Speaks, and it is a behemoth that over the last 15 or so years has grown with literally millions and millions of dollars. And Autism Speaks recently, in the past few years, changed their publicly stated mission statement, moving it from a discussion of cure, which many autistic people have rightly criticized for a very long time, to a mission statement that promises to find the solutions for autism. Language that was meant to somehow euphemize and minimize the harm done by literal of publishing dehumanizing rhetoric about autistic people, of allocating funding related to autism primarily to causes that are about attempting to prevent autistic people from existing, and say, well, we'll call it a solution. And what many of us, especially those of us who've been from multiply marginalized communities, heard was the echoes of language used by fascists for generations. To find a solution to a human problem in the language of eugenics means to eliminate that kind of human. This line of thought is evident in every single form of oppression that we might name and that we might contend with. Capitalism and class oppression tell us, well, what is the problem with poverty? The problem with poverty is poor people. Impoverished people are the problem. And so we can disappear and incarcerate impoverished people. We can deny impoverished people the ability to ever have safe or affordable or healthy housing or food as a way of eliminating impoverished people. What is racial oppression? What is settler colonialism? What does white supremacy teach us? They teach us that the problem with racism is race, and particularly people of color. That negatively racialized people are the problem. If we were not to exist as we are, if our cultures are to be destroyed and disappear, if our families are to be destroyed, then the problem disappears. We become the problem. If we're talking about queernesia or transnesia, it is the very same idea, right? That the problem is not a system of values about who is normal. Rather, the problem becomes us. We become the problem because of our deviance, because of our supposed disorderedness, because we cannot assimilate into or approximate the characteristics, the traits, or the appearance of the resourced, powerful. And so eugenics thinking teaches us that people are the problems to be disappeared, as systems of oppression have always taught us and incentivized us to individualize the experience of oppression, to understand in the position oppressed, marginalized, and minoritized communities as experiencing oppression only because we chose to, or we made bad decisions. It is our own individual fault. We didn't try hard enough. We didn't have a good enough attitude. We are the problem. And if we can moralize and medicalize our supposed failure or inability to be assimilated or to approximate privilege, then we can elide and avoid ever confronting or contending with oppression, systematically or structurally. Simultaneously, oppressive structures have always taught us to individualize the experience of oppression by placing the onus of solving it on the beneficence of privileged, resourced, and powerful people. That if those who occupy a positionality of privilege, power, and resources deign out of their charity and goodwill to help those poor, unfortunate souls, and you can hear it in the language we use, right? The passivity of poor, the passivity of homeless, the passivity of disenfranchised or underprivileged, right? These are words that deliberately disappear the agent, that disappear the cause of violence and oppression, and individualize it to accident, to chance, or to bad attitudes. That if those who have privilege deign to help those who are disenfranchised, underprivileged, historically underrepresented, right? Those words that avoid naming oppression, then it won't be a problem anymore. And in reality, both sides of that coin, individualizing oppression by putting it as our fault, the fault of oppressed people for being oppressed, or by saying that the solution to oppression lies in the beneficence and charity, read the paternalism and saviorism of privileged people, then it will end. In the last 15 plus years, Autism Speaks and similar lobbying organizations have lobbied successfully for the passage of laws increasing drastically the amount of insurance reimbursements for applied behavior analysis. This may seem like a non sequitur to many. The history of applied behavior analysis, more commonly understood as a set of tools and frameworks for behavioral modification, lies in the 1960s, of what we commonly know as ABA. The 1960s saw NIH, National Institutes of Health, funding for a series of experiments carried out by Ole Ivar Lovas, Oleivar Lovas. Lovas first received funding for a set of experiments known colloquially as either the Feminine Boys Project or the Sissy Boys Project, in which a group of children who were assigned male at birth were subjected to a harsh regimen of punishment and reward in order to, quote, prevent the development of heterosexuality, because the children in the study had been flagged as displaying stereotypically feminine or effeminate behavior, interests, ways of speaking, or ways of moving and holding their bodies. And so by stamping out the appearance of any feminine or effeminate characteristics, the researchers sought to prevent the children from becoming, quote unquote, homosexual, right? Now, we don't know how many of the children that participated in that study were perhaps actually cisgender and heterosexual boys. We also don't know how many might have been trans girls or trans feminine in a different way. We don't know how many might have been cisgender boys and queer. We don't actually know that. But the purpose of the experiment was nonetheless to enforce particular standards of masculinity according to a very rigid, patriarchal, and colonial-informed notion of gender, of what a gender role is supposed to be, of what masculinity is supposed to be like, and what is appropriate or permissible for a person to embody in their life and in their literal corporeal reality. The Sissy Boys or Feminine Boys experiment was the precursor to a later study carried out in the same decade, which aimed to apply the exact same framework of punishment and reward to autistic children, including subjecting one autistic girl who was part of the experiment to painful electric shock as a punishment. She would be left barefoot in a room with a metal floor covered with a thin layer of water, the better to enable the painful current to reach her and to shock her so that she could be subjected to that punishment for non-compliance. The histories and legacies of behavioral modification, of forced assimilation, and of literal destruction of anyone who is marginalized way of being is much broader, much deeper, and much longer than the 1960s experiments on behavioral modification. Eugenicist thought is deeply wrapped up in and dependent on ableism, which is itself a system of values about whose body minds are not only normal and healthy and whole, but whose body minds are valuable and worthy and desirable, and conversely, about whose body minds are expendable and disposable. Ableism teaches us which people fundamentally count as human and which people do not. What counts as a disability, what is actually perceived as a disability, have shifted consistently and constantly for cultural reasons in different geographic contexts in different communities and at different points in time. But ableist ideas and values have never actually disappeared. They've simply sometimes shifted form or changed shape. You see, the expansion of insurance reimbursement rates for applied behavior analysis, which sounds innocuous and frankly boring, is tied to a history of decades and decades of policy and practice in academic spaces, by state practices, and in our own communities and neighborhoods, of teaching us and enforcing onto us expectations for what it means to be a person, for what types of behavior a person must display in order to be considered a person, for how someone must comply with the expectations and strictures of white supremacy, of patriarchy, and of ableism, just to be considered worthy of basic dignity, just to be considered worthy of personhood. And we've heard over many days now, over and over and over again, that the connections between oppression and violence at scale against so many marginalized and oppressed communities are deeply interrelated. Are they interchangeable? Of course not. But they are deeply interrelated because ableism and eugenicist thought are not limited only to ideas that are explicitly about or tied to disability. They are not limited only to those people who are labeled specifically as having a disability, because the rhetoric of ableism is present in every single other form of our oppression. Mia Mingus, Mel Baggs, Talila Lewis, and so many others have over and over again demonstrated that you cannot address any form of oppression without understanding how disability and ableism play a large role in shaping, forming, and reforming every other system of oppression. That queer and trans people are somehow unwell, that we need to be fixed, that we need to be rehabilitated and subjected to conversion therapy, which again is the very same modality and methodology as applied behavior analysis as widely used on autistic and other disabled children, right? That the rhetoric of ableism underlies and expands the rhetorics and the practices of class oppression. That capitalism teaches us that if you are impoverished, it is your fault because it's a moral failing, because you're irresponsible, because you are impulsive, because you are reckless. This is literally the language and the logic of ableism. That ableism has undergirded the entire system of land theft, genocide, and forced removal of native peoples and nations in the U.S. and continued genocide and occupation of native peoples' lands and communities. That ableism literally has undergirded the entire history of enslavement. That ableism continues to be a driving force behind legalized enslavement in our carceral systems. That ableism is a driving force behind all forces and all spaces of incarceration and of institutionalization. That ableism is ever present, even and including in spaces like ours, right? The assumptions about which people are deserving of a platform, which people we can look to as leaders, as creators of knowledge, which people we think of as taking a leading role as artists, as cultural workers, as organizers, as advocates, as scholars, even within marginalized communities. We tie our worth, even if we claim not to be doing so, to our labor, to our production, and therefore to our approximation of and assimilation into able expectations of what it means to be, of what it means to be valuable, of what it means to be intelligent, of how it means to perform. We are not able to escape ableist eugenicist ideas, even in the very spaces that supposedly exist to challenge them. In many spaces where I'm part of conversations about disability, I will be asked, what do you want to be shared or read as an introduction or as a biography for you? And I have, like a lot of us who've done work in various spaces like this, many different versions of what those biographies look like. And in the last year or so, I've added to those statements that oftentimes my most important work does not have a job title, does not have a job description, and does not have funding, and perhaps probably never will. And I say that not to devalue or ignore the work I do in many other spaces where I have been compensated for my time or labor, the work that I am doing in different spaces that I occupy that might be attached to a specific organization or to a specific project, but to recognize that much of the work we do in community to build care networks for one another, to practice care work in the ways that so many folks like Lydia Samara and Amy Hamrai and Mimi Cook and many others are constantly talking about, right? That work is not something that we can list on a resume. It's not something that we can say, here's an accomplishment, here's a project, here is a campaign, here's an organization, here is an artistic work to be able to present. The work that we do of survival, the work that we do of supporting one another to survive, the work that we do to mobilize in response to a crisis that isn't necessarily captured or legible within the confines of legal or regulatory structures, that work cannot be described in ways that are recognizable within capitalism or within ableism. In other words, the work that we do as disabled people, just to function in the world, to build community, and to move us toward a future where we don't have to rely upon ad hoc crisis response from within community. That work cannot be contained or recognized within the very structures that devalue our existence to begin with. Over the last 15 years, in the autistic community specifically, and the disabled community more broadly, we've seen an explosion of organizations and projects working on disability from any number of angles, many of them not from a disability justice specific perspective. And in many ways, that's wonderful. I want there to be more people who are working within disabled communities, who are building disabled culture, who are doing disability organizing. And I want so much for us to be able to value our collective work and our communities without having to tie our worth to particular organizations or institutions. Institutions will always fail us. We cannot look to institutions to save us. After all, eugenicist thought pervades the construction and the maintenance of many institutions with which we contend constantly. And for Black and Brown and Native, Asian, Latinx, and mixed race disabled folks, disability advocacy organizations and institutions still inevitably fail us. Why? Because we are not taught to think about disability from any lens or framework other than one that continues to center only those who already and always held the most privilege, power, and resources, even within disabled community. We are not incentivized to think about disability as primarily and necessarily an experience that can arise out of, exacerbate, and be a cause of, as well as come from marginalization, colonization, and oppression. Disability is in fact more prevalent in every marginalized, minoritized, colonized, and oppressed community, relative to every privileged, powerful, and resourced one. If only because of the impacts of unjust eugenicist labor practices, because of eugenicist structures for health care, because of the eugenicist nature of enforced deprivation, neglect, and impoverishment under capitalism, because of the eugenicist nature of the ongoing trauma and terror of white supremacy, of colonialism and imperialism, of occupation and militarization, because of the literal imposition of and constant subjection to trauma and violence, common across all marginalized communities, deriving as a direct result of our oppression. Disability is a more common experience for those of us in any marginalized community than it is for those who belong to privileged communities. And so to grapple with what it means to address ableism as a root cause of and core to the philosophy of eugenics enables us to be able to understand just how vile and endemic eugenicist thought and practice really is. In the last year and a half, we have witnessed the devastating and catastrophic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on marginalized and oppressed communities. Who is most likely, in the beginning and now, to contract COVID-19? People who are impoverished, people who are working in low-wage jobs with little or no labor protections, particularly Black and Brown immigrant workers, often who have caregiving responsibilities, often who are disabled, people who are homeless, people who are living in congregate settings, especially, right? People in nursing homes and other disability institutions, people in jails, people in prison, anyone incarcerated for any reason, right? Who is the most likely to die from COVID, to experience medical discrimination and rationing of care? Disabled folks, particularly, who are Black and Brown disabled folks, who are unhoused disabled folks, who are incarcerated disabled folks. Today, with the distribution of vaccine for COVID-19, who is the most and least likely to be selected for receipt of a vaccine? Well, literally the numbers are in the single digits of what percentage of vaccine doses globally have gone to people living in the global south. Disabled people in the global south are a global majority among disabled people. Who is the least likely to have access to medical care, to vaccines, to jobs, and to life situations and financial stability that will enable a person to be safer from the effects of COVID? Not the people who are at the margins of the margins. Those of us who are present in this conversation might occupy many different spaces and relationships with regard to what our particular vulnerabilities are to COVID, to what our particular situations are with housing, job, or financial stability. But make no mistake, the people who are consistently deemed to have lives not worth living, and therefore lives that are not worth protecting and not worth saving, those who are deemed most expendable and most disposable, have always been disabled people at the margins of the margins. Even if, when and as, disability itself is not the most salient or relevant part of a person's identity or experience, not something that a person may necessarily claim. Disability is present everywhere. Ableism is too. Disability justice framework enables us to understand these deep, broad, and wide connections. That ableism is both necessary for and dependent on every other form of oppression. That ableism shows up in our laws and our policies. It shows up in our cultural values, the mythologies of independence, the mythology of being able to be strong, or what it means to be intelligent, ideas that are themselves wrapped up in fascist and eugenicist ideals of wellness as humanity, of wellness as whiteness as ableness, right? And understanding that reality, this is where we come from, this is what shapes the reality we are dealing with today, will enable us to think for the future, what do we want to build? What are we moving toward? Disability justice offers us a key framework for analysis of our present reality. And it offers us a way of thinking about what we want to be present, what we want to build, what we want to sustain in the future to come. If this convening is largely about addressing the legacies of eugenics and reckoning with their realities today, then it is also about imagining what our future will be like without and past eugenics. Ruth Gilmore, who's a leading abolitionist thinker, theorist, and organizer, describes abolition as a project not of absence, but of presence. This is also how I understand disability justice. Disability justice teaches us to name, recognize, understand, and examine the things that need to be disappeared. Ableism, white supremacy, queer amnesia, all these forms of oppression and violence. The ways in which people experience harm and trauma interpersonally, individually, as well as at the macro level and societally. And disability justice offers us what it is we would like to imagine for the future. If eugenicist organizations and theories and political movements would like to see, for example, autistic people and all other disabled people not to exist anymore, that they imagine a future, as Alison Kafer describes very eloquently, where disability no longer exists because disability is incompatible with a good or desirable future, then what do we imagine instead? If in our future disability is present, if in our future disability is part of and can be part of what it means to live a good life, the disability does not always have to be burden or shame or punishment or weaponization. The disability can also just be. The disability can be valued and honored. As Leah Lakshmi Pepshana Samarasena says, the disability can be kindred. Then what would that be like? What would that look like? What might that feel like? What do we want to be present in our future? As my friend Damian Patrick Williams says in the title of his website, what would be present in a future worth thinking about? We know that eugenics must be our past. We must disappear it. And in so doing, we must work to disappear all of the forms of oppression that uphold it and that perpetuate it. But what are we building? Thank you.